The water was calm, the sky clear, nothing felt out of place. "I'm taking the shot, Justin." Lion's voice crackled through Thecamera rig. "We've almost got it. Keep swimming, mate." But in the blink of an eye, everything changed. The massive stingray bellowed them, shifted, its tail lifted. Anthon, oh no. Steve's hit. Steve is dying. Somebody help get him on board. No way's dying. Panic erupted over the reef. Blood flooded. The water shouts echoed across the open sea as the crew scrambled to save a man the world thought was untouchable. He had served crocodiles, venomous snakes, the deadliest creatures on earth. But not this, not a single silent strike beneath waves. The footage was rolling, but what it captured has never been released on now nearly 2 decades later. We're still asking what exactly happened there beneath the surface of Bat Reef. Why did Stingray strike, and what were Steve Irwin's final words spoken just seconds before the world lost him forever? This is the story of his final dive and themament that changed everything. Welcome to the Animal Quest channel. If stories like this move you, if you believe Steve's legacy should never be forgotten, subscribe, like, and share. You won't want to miss what comes next. He wasn't just a man with a camera, he was a force of nature, relentless, fearless, magnetic. Steve Irwin was born in Essendon, Victoria, Australia, in 1962, but the wild called to him long before most children even understood what danger was. His father, Bob Irwin, was a pathologist, his mother Lynn, a wildlife rehabilitator. By the time Steve could walk, he was already holding snakes. By the time he was 6, he was wrestling crocodiles under his father's watch Fuller, and by the 1990s, the rest of the world began to notice through his hit series, The Crocodile Hunter. Steve exploded onto international television screens, not as a polished host in a suit, but as a sunburnt, cocky-wearing adventurer who treated every creature, no matter how feared, with reverence. Hue and acting, he sprinted barefoot into swamps. He lifted venomous snakes with his bare hands. He dove headfirst into danger, not to provoke, but to educate. His now iconic catchphrase, "Crikey," was never scripted. It was raw excitement, audience Cicerone. The world fell in love with his energy, his authenticity, and his cause to protect the animals so many others misunderstood. His side was his wife, Terry Irwin, an American naturalist he married in 1992. Together, they built the Australia Zoo in Queensland into a world-renowned sanctuary. Their children, Bindi and Robert, grew up in the bush, just like Steve had, hand in hand with creaturist Kukil. But Steve Irwin never seemed afraid, not of crocodiles, not of snakes, not even of sharks. He believed that respect and knowledge could overcome fear, and he trusted the animals worked with completely. That trust was what made him so captivating, so beloved, so irreplaceable, and it's what made Wathapand on Bat Reef so unthinkable base. It wasn't a crocodile, it wasn't a shark, it wasn't one of the creatures Steve Irwin was famous for handling. It was something almost ordinary. A stingray gliding silently in the shallows of the Great Barrier Reef on a quiet Monday morning, and in just a few moments, that silence would be broken by panic, by blood, and by the final words of a man who had spent his entire life defending wild. What could go so wrong in such shallow, tranquil water? What did the camera see, and why has that footage never been released? The answers lie ahead, and there, not what anyone expected, but just off the coast of Port Douglas, Queensland, September 4th, 2006. The sun hung high over the turquoise waters off the Coral Sea. From the surface, it looked like paradise, calm waves rolling over shallow reef, the kind of place you take your family photo, not prepare for disaster. Steve Irwin was there with his trusted team, filming segments for a new wildlife documentary titled Oceans. Deadliest it was, meant to spotlight some of the most feared and misunderstood creatures of the ocean. Box jellyfish, sea snakes, crocodiles, but that day shoot wasn't supposed to be dangerous at all, with main production paused due to bad weather. Further out at sea, Steve and his cameraman, Justin Lyons, decided to make use of the lull. They would film some simple B-roll, quiet, shallow shots of Steve swimming above the reef, something in gentle filler footage. No one expected it'd be the last time a camera would ever film Steve Irwin alive. They slipped into the water late that morning. The plan was straightforward: filmed Steve swimming over reef flats, capturing graceful movement in natural interaction. These were easy shots. They'd done this kind of thing 100 times before. As Steve glided silently just a few feet above seafloor, his eyes caught movement: a massive, short-tailed stingray, nearly 8 feet wide, resting calmly on the sandy bottom. Stingrays, while equipped with venomous barbs, are generally passive creatures. Steve had encountered them countless times. There was no fear, only fascination. Began filming immediately, tracking Steve. As he moved in closer for a better angle, the stingray stirred gently, but did not flee. It appeared relaxed, placid. Even as Steve floated above it, they circled it slowly, careful not to block its escape route. But something shifted in a split second. The dissolved. The cameras were still rolling, but this wasn't footage meant for the world. This was tragedy unfolding in real time. Water that day at Bat Reef was unusually clear, crystalline, almost dreamlike. Just beneath the surface, Steve, Wynn, and Justin Lyons moved, silent, lithe sun above them, casting soft, wavy shadows across the ocean floor. They hadn't this countless times, man and camera in harmony, chasing the perfect underwater shot. But on this day, fate was circling just beneath the sand. Festing was massive, a bull remeasuring nearly 8 feet across its flat diamond-shaped body, blending into Thesia bottom like a living shadow. It was swimming, slowly gliding just above their reef like a ghost, unbothered by the presence of 2 men floating behind it. Justin's camera rolled steadily as Steve's flowed, the creature calmly, confident. Liner sudden movements, no threat. It was routing. The stingray was swimming away, and Steve wanted one last Passover shot, just one. He hovered above it, letting it lead for the cleanest frame button. It happened without warning. The stingray stopped it, turned in a flash. It launched upward, its tail arching with a natural speed, and in that split second, less than 2 seconds, Justin would later say it unleashed a rapid series of strikes, its barb lashing out wildly in defense. More than 100 times it thrust its tail in less than 5 seconds, a frantic blur. Most of the blows missed or glanced off harmlessly, but one did. No knee barb, serrated, razor sharp, and laced with venom, pierced Steve Irwin's chest. A strike so precise and so violent that it tore directly into his thoracic cavity. In the moment, no one could have known what the stingray's tail had done. Justin assumed it had punctured Steve's lung. Fit would be serious, but survivable. They were trained. They had dealt with worse. There was time, but Steve knew hadn't scream. He didn't panic. He simply surfaced, locked eyes with Justin, and with a calmness that chilled everyone. Will heard the story later. He was words no one was ready for. I'm dying. Blood was already clouding the water as Justin rushed to pull him onto the inflatable boat. Steve, fighting through shock and pain, pulled the stingray barb from his own chest. The wound was deep-earthened. Anyone realized the venom wasn't threat, it was the location. The stingray strike had pierced the wall of Steve's heart. The bleeding was massive, internal, catastrophic. As the crew frantically began CPR on the deck, the reef stretched out behind them, still beautiful, still quiet, but nothing about that moment felt natural. Nothing about it felt survivable, because this wasn't a scene from one of Steve's shows. This was real, and it was happening too fast. And even now, no one could believe the truth. Steve Irwin, the man who had served crocodiles, venomous snakes, and willed predators, was dying not from a beast, not from fangs, but from a single perfect strike from a creature no one had ever feareth. Ocean gave no warning, no change in current, no cry of alarm, not screamed, no shouted, whispered. Certain Justin froze. For a heartbeat, it didn't compute. This was Steve Irwin. He didn't say things like that. He didn't die, but intos. 2 words, there was no doubt. Steve wasn't guessing, he knew. The stingray was gone, long gone. It had delivered its blow and retreated into the reef as silently as it came, but the damage had already been done. The puncture wound was small, just a few centimeters wide, but inside it had torn through Steve's pericardium sac that protects the heart. Blood was filling his chest cavity. Every minute that passed, he slipped further away. They performed CPR for over an horn and stop, compressing his chest, counting breaths, begging for signs. There was no ambulance to call, no emergency room. Just down the road they were a floating tridge unit in the middle of the coral sea, fighting to bring back a man thralled, adored. Justin later recalled, "We thought we might be able to save him, we hopped, but deep down I think we are." As they sped back toward Port Douglas, the boat crashing over waves, the energy on board shifted from urgency to helplessness, and then to silence. Steve Irwin's heart had stopped. There was no screaming, no dramatic moment, just the weight of it, the unbearable realization settling in as the sky above remained blue, and the water eerily still. The Great Barrier Reef, the very place he had loved so deeply, had just taken him. And as the boat raced toward shore, Karinga, lifeless body and a grieving crew, remained unaware, but that ways about to change. A boat reached low isles, a speck of sand and coral off the coast of Port Douglas, where paramedics were waiting on shore, but they already knew there was no pulse, no breath, no hope. At 12:53 p.m. on September 4th, 2006, Steve Irwin, Australia's most beloved wildlife farrier, was officially pronounced dead. Cause: a penetrating heart injury from a stingray barb. It had pierced his chest at just the wrong angle, cutting through the wall of his heart like a blade. Injury was described by the medical examiner as unsurvivable. The team that had filmed him for years followed him into jungles and swamps and rivers. Nose stood in the stunned silence. Cameraman Justin Lyons, still shaking, would later say, "We thought we were filming a beautiful shot of a stingray swimming gand. Then out of nowhere, it turned into the worst moment of our lives." News of Steve Irwin's death spread like wildfire in the hours that followed. Headlines wept across continents. CNN, BBC, ABC, SKY and EWS, every outlet ran with the same surreal words: Steve Irwin killed by stingray. It didn't make sense. People didn't believe it at first. It felt like a hoax, some cruel internet rumor, a mistake, a misunderstanding. But it wasn't. That evening, thousands of people had gathered outside Australia Zoo in Burwock, Queensland, leaving flowers, candles and written notes. Some wept openly, stood in stunned silence, ice-locked on the flickering candles, like they were waiting to wake up from a bad dream. Across the world, from London to Tollison, Angela's impromptu memorials sprung up in parks, on beaches, outside embassy. Children drew crayon sketches of crocodiles and wrote letters that said, "Thank you for teaching us not to be." But the most heartbreaking trait came days later, during a nationally televised memorial service at Queensland's Australia Zoo, Crocker somewhere. Steve had once stood in front of roaring crowds and massive reptiles, with nothing but a grin this time. The crowd sat in silence, and into that silence stepped Bindi Irwin, his 8-year-old daughter, clutching a folded piece of a paper. With shaking hands, she didn't cry, didn't stumble. In a soft, steady voice, she said, "My daddy was my hero. He was always there for me when I needed him. He listened to me and taught me so many things. I want to help endangered wildlife, just like he did." There wasn't a dry eye in the stadium. The loss was too big, too sudden, too cruel. Steve Irwin had faced down death 100 times before, smiling, laughing, always walking away. But this time, death didn't come with a roar or a warning. It came silently from below, from a creature no one feared in water no one thought dangerous, and that is what made it so hard to accept. The world had lost a man who wasn't just fearless, but who had made us feel brave. The aftermath as shock gave way to questions. The world turned to experts, marine biologists, venom specialists, and normal behaviorists, searching for an answer to the unthinkable. How could these sharpened stingrays by nature are not aggressive? They don't chase, they don't stalk, they don't attack. Their first instinct, when threatened, is to flee, to vanish into the sand or dart into deeper water. And yet, on that day, at bat-phone of them killed, the world's most experienced wildlife handler, it didn't make sense until you look closer. The stingray that struck Steve Irwin was a short-tailed stingray, a species known for its immense size and powerful tail. Along the top of that tail sits a venomous barb, sharp as a dagger and serrated like a hunting knife. But it's not a weapon of pursuit. It's a defensive mechanism used only when the animal feels cornered or threatened, and that's what experts believe happened. As Steve swam above the ray, the creature, likely sensing danger from above and unsure of its escape, reacted instinctively. It flicked its tail upward in one rapid strike, a last-second reflex to defend itself. It wasn't calculated, it wasn't personal, but it was devastating. The barb struck Steve at the worst possible angle, piercing his chest and slicing into the pericardium, the thin sac that surrounds and protects the heart. In most stingray encounters, the tail hits limbs, the torso, foot, painful injuries, but rarely fatal. This one was different. The strike had been perfectly placed, a 1 in a million trajectory that bypassed ribs and muscle and landed a direct blow to own off the body's most fragile and vital areas. Even if it had happened in rooms surrounded by surgeons and equipment, survival would have been unlikely. Out there on the reef, miles from help, it was impossible. It was a biological accident, a tragic collision of instinct, timing, and anatomy. No one was to blame, not Steve, not the stingray, but that didn't make it any easier to understand, because this wasn't the first time Steve had swam with rays. It wasn't even the hunt. He'd been around them for decades. He knew their patterns, their limits, their body language. He understood their behavior better than most scientists. But that morning on the reef, all it took was a moment, one flick of a tail, one wrong angle, and the result was irreversible. Bore 2006, there had only been 2 documented stingray fatalities in all of Australian history. Steve Irwin became a third. The world had spent years watching him dance with death, dodging crocodile jaws, handling king cobras, leaning inches from danger. But it wasn't any of those things that took him. It wasted one animal no one saw coming. Somewhere in that water, somewhere between the reef and the horizon, a camera was still rolling as the stingray struck, as the blood filled the sea. As Steve Irwin, arguably the most recognized wildlife figure in the world, realized he was dying, the footage exists, or at least it did. Justin Lyons, the cameraman who had filmed alongside Steve 4 years, confirmed in interviews that the NT-Ray incident had been captured on tape. From the moment Steve approached the stingray, the moment he surfaced, whispered his final words, and collapsed in the boat, heckled it, the most devastating moment of his life. And yet, that footage was never shown to the public, never aired, never leaked, never released. In fact, according to Steve's widow, Terry Irwin, the only person who had the legal right to decide what happened to it. The footage was either locked away permanently or destroyed altogether in later interviews said that tape should never be seen. It's not who Steve was, that memento isn't represent his legacy. It ends, heightened, just like that. The final seconds of Steve Irwin's life became one of their most whispered about lost tapes. In television history, there were rumors, of course, speculation, fake clips uploaded, opportunists claiming to show dive the stingray, strike the blood, in the water, all of it false, all of it tasteless, but the real footage, it's gone, and perhaps that's for the best, because what value would it bring? Would watching thought moment answer any questions we haven't already asked, or would it just immortalize his death, reduce a lifetime of passion, risk, and wild love to a single tragic scene? The debate has lingered for years. Some argue that, as a public figure, as a conservationist, who lived and died on camera, Steve's phenomenons belong to the people that seeing it could serve as a cautionary tale, a reminder of how unpredictable nature can be, but others, those closest to him, insist that his legacy was never meant to end in a viral clip. His legacy lives in the thousands of animals he saved, the millions of children he inspired, the family that still walks in his shadows. Daughter Bindi, now a mother herself, his son Robert carrying a camera just like his dad, and so the tape remains some scene, not because it's being hidden, but maybe, just maybe, it was never meant to be seen at all, because the most haunting moment of Steve Irwin's life is the one the world will never witness there. Steve Irwin's life ended far too soon. His mission, his fire, never did. The world mourned the man. But what he stood for, that only grew louder in the heart of Queensland. The Australia Zoo, once a modest reptile park run by his parents, now stands as a living monument to Steve's dream. It's more than a zoo, it's a sanctuary, a battleground for species, a classroom for their next generation of wildlife warriors, and at the front of it all are his children. Bindi Irwin, who was just 8 when her father died, grew into a conservationist in her own right. She speaks with some heart, carries the same courage, and walks into enclosures with the same calm determination. Robert Irwin, barely 3 years old when he lost his dad, now holds a camera, just like Steve once did, capturing animals in the wild, teaching viewers around the world that never come before understanding to girth. They've carried their father's torch, not just with pride but with power, through documentaries, public outreach, conservant programs, and hands in animal rescue. The Irwins have prevented that. Steve's legacy is not frozen in time, it's alive. The family's non-profit Wildlife Warriors has funded anti-poaching efforts in Africa, supported animal hospitals in Australia, and responded to disasters from bush, foresto floods. Thousands of lives, both human and animal, have been saved in Steve's name, because, to him, every creature mattered. Every animal deserved a chance, and every child who watched him wrestle, crocodile, or kiss a snake was banged out. Something quietly revolutionary. If the wild wasn't something to fear, it was something to fight for. Steve Irwin's voice may be silent, but his message echoes louder than ever, and the impact it's still growing. Wasn't reckless, he wasn't naive, he knew the risks better than anyone, and still, he chose to step into the wild every single day, not for fame, not for thrill, but to protect the voiceless. And in the end, it wasn't a monster that took him, it wasn't fury, it wasn't vengeance, sight was instinct, a reflex, a heartbeat, some raw pulse of nature he had spent this entire life trying to defend, because the truth is the wild is breathtaking. It is never truly safe. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, if Steve's legacy inspires you, even now, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Here are more stories that deserve Tobe, told more lives to honor, and together we'll keep his mission alive.